Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Maybe morning for some of you, depending on where you are. My name is Richard Vine. My job here today is really just to introduce Giles Prettyjohn, who's our livestock manager of many years standing, who's going to talk to you about the wildlife livestock integration system on Ol Pejeta. And then Caroline Nguendo, who's going to talk about some of the ecological benefits of cattle from a kind of ecological perspective, particularly the BOMR'S system to create hotspots that has been developed here. So I won't talk much, but if you've got questions, please do type them in as we go along, and we'll try and answer them as either we see them, or perhaps, depending on how many questions there are, we'll wait until we get to the end. So with no more ado, let me pass you on to Giles Prettyjohn.
Hello everyone. We're going to start. Our subject today is livestock integrated with the wildlife in a conservancy situation like Ol Pejeta. And that picture just shows us the sort of what we have here on Ol Pejeta. And I'm going to start the proceedings with a bit of history of Ol Pejeta to show you how we've developed over the years and got to where we are now. And the first photo on the slide shows Ol Pejeta in the 1960s. If you can look at it clearly, it's divided up by fence lines. These are paddocks purely for cattle production, beef production in a fairly intensive way. And at this time in the 1950s and 60s, there was very little room for wildlife. Ol Pejeta developed on the back of beef production without wildlife, which meant cattle could roam within those paddocks 24 hours a day, occasionally rounded up for tick control. And each paddock was watered, and it became a highly successful, profitable beef production unit. Now, going to the next picture in the slide, shows you what Ol Pejeta looked like in the late 1980s and 90s, whereby Sweetwater's Rhino Sanctuary was formed on the eastern sector, a 20,000 acre sanctuary specially made for rescuing rhino during a heavy poaching era in the country. And that area was fenced off with a game fence, basically isolating it from the rest of the cattle ranch. The first tourist venue was built within there in the 90s, and livestock were basically kept out. So we had cattle ranching on the western side and southern, and the eastern side was purely for wildlife and tourism. And this lasted for nearly 20 years, which taught us a great lesson later in our management program. And then in 2005, the bottom photo on the slide, it shows how Ol Pejeta is now, with the greater Conservancy area in green, about 75,000 acres. And within this area, we integrate our livestock with the wildlife. And I'll go on to the next slide. We are holding about 7,500 cattle on Ol Pejeta, and these are split into herds of approximately 150 head each, and 2 men will be looking after each herd to protect against the wildlife. Grazing is controlled by the management, and each herd is told where it can graze and what its boundaries are. And at night, the cattle are put in predator-proof BOMR'S, as the picture shows, which are mobile and can be moved on a regular basis, but they protect the cattle, especially from the lion at night. Now we use, as you can see, the herd grazing there is kept fairly tight as a herd, and this is the important in our grazing program, that we are able to herd these cattle within close proximity of each other, A, to prevent predators getting at them, and B, to use as a tool on our rangeland management. The breed we use on Ol Pejeta is, we call it the improved Boran, and it originates from northeastern Kenya, where the Boran tribe have had their cattle for centuries. The lower left picture shows an indigenous Boran in northeast Kenya, and this is where our improved Boran derived from, possibly 80 to 100 years ago, with the early ranchers in the Laikipia district and Rift Valleys part of Kenya. Why do we use Boran? Because basically they were developed as the most suitable breed for our type of environment. They produce high quality beef off the natural pastures, and also, because of their herding instinct, are easy to manage in a wildlife situation. So that is the reason why we have Boran, and it's become so successful in what it does, it's now spreading over the whole of Africa. Just to show what cattle can do for a grazing situation, we learnt in that Sweetwater's Rhino Sanctuary, which had no cattle for nearly 20 years, the grass will tend to go rank where there's not enough big herds of wildlife to graze it down. And as a result, the whole quality of the grazing is reduced. Now, we've learned to use cattle as a tool to graze areas that otherwise would not be preferred by wildlife, but you can force the cattle in there because they're being herded. And as a result, they can produce grazing lawns which the wildlife prefer, as seen in the lower two pictures. Most wildlife prefer the shorter grass. It's sweeter, it's probably more nutritional value, and the cattle herds can actually create this through intensive grazing systems. The top picture on the left is an example of a good high quality pasture that we're creating on Ol Pejeta now, with a lot of bulk. And the trick is not to let this sit around without being grazed for a year or two, otherwise it goes rank and nothing wants to eat it. In the past, areas like that went rank would be burnt, and in those pictures of early Ol Pejeta, they would have had a burning program of every 7 years or something in order to produce fresh grazing. We can replicate that through cattle grazing instead than using fire, and at the same time retain our bush, which is utilized by our black rhino, giraffe and such animals. We've mentioned that we use the mobile predator-proof boma to protect the cattle at night from lion mainly and other predators. On the top left picture, it's not so clear, but you can see a herd of cattle within a boma in the evening, and they'll sleep there all night and create an area of fertilized with their dung, which you can see those circles on the right, which after a season of rain or so will start to grass over, and generally a new species of grass, succulent and nutritional, will come up in those areas. And the bottom left picture shows such an area after a couple of seasons of rain, very lush, nutritious grass, which we find that the wildlife prefer over old grasses. And so these, and Caroline will be explaining later how this has an effect on our landscape. But at the same time, the cattle are well protected at night against predators. So we actually serve two purposes with this mobile boma. I'll hand you over to Caroline for the next half and be ready to answer questions later.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us. I'll take you through the ecological effects. You find that livestock bomas usually presents a positive synergistic relationship between cattle production and wildlife integration, which is a model that we have at Ol Pejeta. So what basically shapes the African savanna, we have various interacting effects, as Giles has already mentioned. So we have fire and herbivory being the two main factors that usually shape the savanna. But with the innovation of BOMR'S at Ol Pejeta, we've realized that this presents a better way of maintaining the system, in that you can be able to easily manipulate and get faster effects by using the BOMR compared to the other two components. So from an ecological perspective, you find that we are able to achieve an ecosystem level effect, given that we stack these cattle within the kraals at night, and there's deposition of dung, which gives us a good layer, and this layer is approximately around 50 centimeters deep, which is sufficient enough to enrich those areas. And also, from an extensive perspective, the edge effects usually tend to spread out to 100 meters, and this gives us a bigger space. And over the years, we've learned that we can be able to create daisies from these BOMR'S, and within a short period, we can able to create a hotspot. And this usually persists for decades, because after trialing the livestock, later on when wildlife utilize these areas, they continue enriching those particular spots. Also, in the aspect of it kind of increases the functional and structural heterogeneity of the landscape, and this is based on the ongoing monitoring of the ecological effects that we've been studying, and there are various evidences that have shown that this is a viable measure. And you can be able to use it also to improve the grazing distribution of wildlife, in that by creating these grazing hotspots in different areas, you can be able to move around the wildlife within the space, and this also facilitates the tourism aspect. And we also have data that supports that in these grazing hotspots, they usually increase the diversity of various species. Like we have avian diversity, as you can be able to see from this particular graph. When you look at the various management practices, the black indicating the BOMR'S, then the red burnt areas and the control areas, you realize that high diversity of birds were seen in BOMR sites. And other research also has shown that we have high gecko densities, and among other species, even rare rodent species. So basically, these hotspots usually increase the diversity and abundance of species in various areas. Additionally, when you integrate livestock and wildlife within the same system, this usually reduces the tick densities within the landscape. From the graph, you can be able to see the various land practices. We have Borana, Ol Pejeta, Suyan, and Lewa conservancies. These conservancies have livestock and wildlife, but at different densities. You find that Ol Pejeta has got a high density of both wildlife and livestock, and because we integrate the two together, and we treat our cattle, it tends to reduce the tick densities both on the wildlife bit and also the livestock bit. Also, given that these can be a model that can be applied to pastoral areas where we have degraded landscapes, these, with the establishment of these BOMR sites, they can be used to revegetate bare patches, and this also enables creation of hotspots in those particular areas and restores those areas. Last but not least, also, we find that these open glades usually creates treeless glades, and these are kind of open and improve the predator protection for most herbivore species, and we've realized that in most cases, herbivores tend to utilize these open glades in most cases. I take you back to Jabs.
Thank you, Caroline. We can now go on, having discussed what we've seen, what are the pros and cons of integrating wildlife and cattle? As we have seen, we have greatly improved the pasture management on Ol Pejeta as a result of having cattle there. And because of that, our population of wildlife herbivores have grown tremendously and are healthy and reproduce probably more often than elsewhere. And as a result, our game populations as a whole are on the increase. Caroline has mentioned the tick population control. We have to spray our cattle to prevent them actually dying of tick-borne diseases. And so what they are doing is they're picking up the ticks in the bush during the week's grazing, come through a spray race, and that tick population is controlled. So this is done continuously, which has an effect on the whole tick population of the rangeland, which in turn helps the wildlife with their actual tick challenges. Economically, we're far better off earning income from tourism and beef together rather than one or the other. In the past, ranchers have concentrated on either doing beef or on tourism, and it's only recently we discovered that doing both together is a far better way economically. Politicians prefer it, utilization of the land is much better, and we have more eggs in the basket. When tourism goes down, we have beef to pick it up, and when there's a drought, vice versa. In the 10 years that we've been doing the integration, cattle living with wildlife, we have realized that it's the best that Ol Pejeta has ever done. We are employing 3 or 4 times more people now than we were 15 years ago. And we are at the same time able to help our surrounding communities because we are earning more now than we used to with cattle alone. Through integration, we realized that the whole rangeland can be kept in a much better state, and everything benefits wildlife and cattle together. And it is worthwhile us having cattle together with wildlife, even though we expect a 3% loss to the cattle herd through predation and tick-borne diseases together. But that far outweighs any of the benefits that we get from the tourism side with the wildlife. So with that, coming soon, we'll end with our last slide. We like to think that Ol Pejeta has developed an integration system which can be used in conservation areas anywhere, pastoral areas, national parks, cattle ranches. We feel our model can be used in any of those places as a success. And we invite anybody to come and see what we have here on Ol Pejeta, how it works, and offer ideas of where it could work elsewhere, not only in Kenya, but Africa and the world. Thanks very much for listening in. Richard Vine, our CEO, would like to end with a few words.
That's great. Thank you, Giles and Caroline. No, I thought that was fascinating. I think the point that Giles is making towards the end was the opportunity, what effectively this system does is reduce the opportunity costs of wildlife. So in other words, we're able to go to Mutara to the north of us to secure more land, to retain our connectivity to the rest of Laikipia, and to provide more space for our rhinos by offering them the integrated system, whereby they not only continue to benefit from cattle, but also benefit from increased wildlife, and that in turn provides a platform for tourism revenues. If instead we'd gone to them and said, look, we need this area for rhinos, and we'd like to keep it as a wildlife corridor, and that has to be at the exclusion of cattle, they would have laughed at us. The fact that we were able to offer the integrated system, in other words, reduce the opportunity costs of wildlife, meant that it became a tenable option for them to consider. So for us, that's the importance of this whole system. It opens up more conservation areas across Africa, and it illustrates the point that the kind of old models of fortress conservation as espoused at the turn of the century and beyond by the national park systems that were set up across the world are actually not the only solution for a kind of more a more sustainable use of land that accommodates the needs of conservation as well as the needs of human beings. So I'm not sure if there have been any questions. I can't see any, I don't think, but maybe there are. In which case, we'll try and answer those just now. William, can you come and help me? Thanks. Okay, so the first question is, how often are these BOMR'S moved, or is that something dependent on the local rainfall condition? And that was from Bill Adams. I'll let Giles answer that question, and then we'll go on to the next one.
How often are BOMR'S moved? You're right, it does depend on the rainfall conditions. The more rain you get, the more we've got to move them, just because it turns to mud on our type of soils, it turns to mud very quickly. But mainly in the long term, we look at the ultimate time would be about 2 weeks is ideal. It gives us the right amount of manure on that site, and not too much so that it doesn't go back to grass quickly. So we reckon 2 weeks does the job. It'll kill off whatever grass was there before, which is why we use this as a tool to get rid of species that we don't want and introduce the new nutritive species that come up with the manure. Thanks.
And then the second question was from Stephen Chege. I'm too far away to read it. What does it say?
Would you recommend cattle and wildlife integration in Kenya national parks? Stephen, absolutely. There are certain parks that would do well to have a similar system, no doubt at all. The success that Ol Pejeta has had with this, a lot of the parks who much of the time are fighting intrusions and illegal grazing could be utilizing those pastoralist cattle for this purpose instead. Yes.
Okay, just to add to that quickly, I would agree with Giles 100%. If you take the example of Tsavo National Park, where illegal incursions by pastoralist cattle occupy large parts of that park, where the authorities are continually having to fight battles to remove those cattle, leading to bad relationships with those communities who own those cattle, leading to huge use of resources in a kind of law enforcement role. Whereas what you could do theoretically is offer grazing in a controlled way to pastoralist groups, for which the park authority could be paid, because pastoralist groups these days are much more amenable to paying for access to grazing, thus providing extra resources for the administration of the park, as well as developing good relationships with the communities around the park, who in turn would support its continued existence. So for us, it's definitely a model that could be applied in many different places across Kenya. Okay, so those are the only two questions we've got. Thanks everybody who turned up to listen. We'll put this out on the internet through social media. So if there are any friends of yours, or if you would like to listen to this again, please feel free. And if there's any further questions that may occur to you going forwards, please do feel free to contact us. all of our contacts are on the internet. So we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much indeed. One more question has just come in. This is from David Manoa. The predator-proof Burma, can they be used in the normal setting with pastoralist community? How affordable are they to community, e.g. Maasai?
David Manoa, good question. It's not necessary. We have built here sections made out of metal, and they are quite expensive. But it's not necessary to use metal as a form of making a mobile Burma. For instance, Alan Savory in Zimbabwe developed an idea of he developed a Burma using local, natural saplings from bush, which was very effective against for protection against lion and so on, and had the same effect, was easily movable and so on. So I think each community should look at the different ways of making these Burmas. It doesn't have to be expensive. I hope that answers your query. David, thank you.
Okay, good. Thanks very much, everybody, for listening, and we look forward to hearing from you soon.